All right, Chapter 25, Part 2, Rise of Nativism. Nativists are the people already here who have this strong anti-immigrant feeling towards the flood of new immigrants arriving in the late early 1900s. There is a recession. Remember, it's the economy, stupid. And so they feel like the new immigrant is taking their jobs. Many times they are, because they will work for less. Factory owners preferred hiring them over existing Americans because they would work for less, because they didn't demand to join unions, because they had many a time signed yellow dog contracts that they wouldn't join unions. And so this causes that person already here to have huge amounts of resentment and work towards passing immigration restriction laws. Between 1877 and 1890, 8.2 million entered the U.S., but by 1900 it was 25 million. By 1890, 15% of the U.S. population was foreign-born, and that just seems like a flood to the already existing Americans. And this fear of foreigners grew. President McKinley is going to be the third president to be assassinated. You get Lincoln, and then remember you had Garfield. Well, McKinley is president at the turn of the century, and he's killed by an anarchist and somebody of immigrant descent. And so obviously there's this anti-foreign sentiment about anarchy, because the guy who killed him was an anarchist, thought one man shouldn't have that kind of power. And so at this point in time, you have a situation where there's this strong sense of anti-immigrant. And a lot of the immigrants were not Protestants, and so they were Catholic or they were Jewish. And this is when the new Klan is going to be born. This new Klan is going to be the most powerful and largest in numbered Klan in American history. When the first Klan that formed during Reconstruction, they kind of fizzled out because they got what they wanted, when the white redeemers took back charge and came back into the fold of the South. And so there wasn't a need for a Klan. Well, this is a rebirth of a new Klan, and they got new enemies. And enemy number one is always going to be the African American, but enemy number 2 and 3 are going to be the people of Catholic and Jewish descent, or this immigrant that's foreign born. They also are anti women who seem to be not knowing their place. Anyway, Birth of a Nation is a movie that comes out during this period of time. You can look it up on YouTube. It's I would be definitely showing you pieces of this, but it was horribly racist, and it was written at a time where the Klan is literally considered heroes. It was Wilson was president at the time. Wilson's from Virginia, by the way, and he said it's going to be like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it was also true. I mean, it wasn't true. Birth of a Nation was one of the staunchly racist films of all time. But it kind of shows you how powerful the Klan had become. But to show you some of the impact of the immigrants, more Italians lived in New York than in Naples, Italy. More Germans lived in New York than Hamburg, Germany. Twice as many Irish lived in New York than in Dublin, Ireland, the capital of Ireland. 75% of Chicago's population was foreign-born. 66% of Boston's population was foreign-born. 50% of Philadelphia's population was foreign-born. And so all of that reality caused people to want to join associations like the APA, American Protective Association. This organization was anti-Catholic. They become upset by the fact that by 1900, Catholics had become the largest denomination with 9 million. Now, you remember the Great Awakening. It branched a bunch of Protestant faiths off into new directions, like Protestants became Methodist or Baptist or Episcopalian or Presbyterian or, Church of God or what have you. And you can see them all right here. So it isn't like that if you counted up all the Protestants that the Catholics outnumbered the Protestants. Clearly they don't. But the fact that the Catholic faith had become the largest domination out of all the other Protestant faiths was enough for this league to be formed. And it tended to be extremely anti-Catholic. And so this organization was referencing the fact that 4 to 5 were foreign-born in New York. And so they start launching anti-Catholic attacks by 1887. They vowed not to hire Catholics. Irish Catholics are going to suffer the most. Many colleges and businesses and social clubs refuse to admit Catholics. And this is where that term WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, came about. And then they called the new immigrant scum that was washed up by this immigrant tide. And so these were obviously anti-Catholic. And then they have enough push that the anti-immigration streak founded in Boston in 1894, they're going to try to be keeping out undesirables from Southeastern Europe. And they're going to push the government to pass literacy tests. And basically the the factory owners would be very opposed to this. They want to hire the new immigrant because he's cheaper and because he doesn't join unions and because he'll work longer and harder in horrible working conditions. So they're going to be pushing this not to be passed. And so although this passes through legislation, it's vetoed by 3 different presidents. But it's finally made law with an override. That's how much pressure is on Congress, and enacted in 1917. It makes you read or write 40 words in your native language, and it greatly curtails immigration. It just has to be the head of the household. It doesn't have to be everybody. But they wanted to fine steamships for bringing undesirables. So then the steamship has to take this movement into picking and choosing amongst immigrants they're bringing to America. And remember, the steamships are in it for the money, and so they don't want to have you rejected, so they'll comply because then they got to pay for you to come back, and that's when the cargo is the most profit for them. And your seat's going to basically mean another bit of cargo can't make it to Europe. So they all are obviously able to pass the Ferran Act. This is kind of a silly law because it makes it illegal for American industrialists to go to Europe and encourage or recruit immigrants to the U.S., but it's not enforceable. So it's kind of one of those feel-good laws that really has no teeth to it, because it's not like you can enforce this over in Europe. You only really have that power. And so you don't know if the industrialists are still encouraging or recruiting it, because you really can't enforce this when the law is over in Europe, or when the law is here, but the enforcement would have to be in Europe. And so that's pretty much the difficult part of it. But on the West Coast, there is a depression of 1873, and again, 25% unemployment. That's going to cause a lot of hatred, and they're going to look to the Chinese, who seem to keep their jobs because they do work for less, because they do work harder and such. So the anti-Chinese gets ramped up during this period of time, and there's a lot of pressure put on Congress to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this anti-Chinese sentiment was led by this Dennis Kearney, and he himself was an actual Irish immigrant. So it's the pot calling the kettle black kind of situation. But the Chinese Exclusion Act was a law passed by Congress, signed by the president, and it responded to banning entry of all Chinese for 10 years, unless you were a student, teacher, merchant, tourist, or government official. It's not repealed until World War II, when literally the Japanese invade Manchuria and were desperate to help the Chinese get out from the persecution and the execution by the Japanese, that will finally repeal this in the middle of World War II. But anyway, the Chinese are already here, and there were tens of thousands of them. They now couldn't become citizens. And the Chinese men living here were also now can't become citizens, and they're prohibited from bringing their wives or bringing their kids. And they're now forced to become birds of passage. So when I had told you about the push and the pull factors, this is the reason that they are going to be more successful at birds of passage than any other nation. And the anti-Chinese sentiment, like I said, is just wholly horrible for the Chinese on the West Coast. But this is the first time since the Alien Sedition Act that we've restricted immigration. And remember how far that went, or how, badly that was. And so obviously, you can do a lot of comparisons today. You remember Trump's Muslim ban. And so, history does tend to repeat itself. The only way to handle this was by doing literacy tests or by restricting population, because it just seemed like a flood. Remember, Europe's population had doubled, and so there was us as a nation being a relief mechanism for Europe. Australia and New Zealand were also, and Canada, receiving a lot of immigrants during this period of time, but nobody as much as the United States. This is, a picture that you would be able to identify in a quiz. This is Uncle Sam, and you can see the Chinese aboard the steamship. And then they represent some type of box union, and these would be the nativists who are like not happy they were coming in. This is another cartoon that you would have to be able to recognize. And then this is the Southeastern European and all of his baggage, and Uncle Sam kind of, restricting his entry based on all that baggage, poverty, disease. The Sabbath means that he is of Jewish faith and such. Anarchy is a belief system here. And so obviously this is showing that Uncle Sam is tiring of all these all these immigrants coming in. This one is an anti-Catholic one, and so I don't know if you realize it, but these look like alligators, but they are actually, the cardinals and the Pope and the bishops and such. And these are supposed to be the nativists and, the U.S. public school, because Catholics tended to send their kids to parochial schools instead of public schools. So the public school is, in the upside down flag, suggesting some kind of, they're in trouble of some sort, and these nativists are trying to get off the beaches because they're supposed to be this proper American. So this is obviously an anti-Catholic. And this is the Chinese Wall around the United States of America, the Wall of China, the Great Wall of China and such. And this is trying to obviously exclude the Chinese from coming in. And then this is equal rights to all men. Obviously, though, the Chinese don't apply in this image. They don't believe that they are of human value, equaling of rights. And so this is some cartoons from the riots on the Chinese. And so I think that is it, right? Okay, so I think you should be able to answer some of these for your test tomorrow by midnight. And so this 1860 to 1900, what happened to the population of this country, explain the differences between the Northwestern European and the Southeastern European. There's this huge shift. There's huge differences between the Southeastern European and the Northwestern European. And the differences between Angel and Ellis Island. 3 exams that you might have to experience at Ellis Island: a physical, a literacy test, your social, political opinions about such. At Ellis Island, they watched you march in from the steamship, and the doctors were actually watching you march up the stairs. And if you seem to show a limp, or if you seem to show some kind of disdain, or you seem to show some kind of ailment, most of the immigrants wore these black, dark jackets and such. So they'd have chalk, and they would just X you with a code of what might be wrong with you. And then that meant that you were going to be pulled out later. So people aboard the steamship would actually tell you, hey, just, wipe off that chalk as best as you can. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But basically the nativists, they're the ones who are going to be so resistant to this new immigrant. And what you need to know is the experience aboard the steamship, how Ellis Island's agents might have changed foreign names, might make them sound more American-like. Really, though, only 2% are going to be rejected. What was the number reason for deportation? It tended to be sickness or radical ideology. The American Protective Association, that's an anti-Catholic league. Why was there such fear of Catholics and Jews? This goes back to the origins of American history, where, this Protestant nation did tend to be anti-Catholic. The Immigration Restriction League, they're the group that's going to be able to get the immigration literacy tests and such to try to weed out the undesirables. But really, it's about how the immigrant would work for less. And it was about he wouldn't join unions. And here the worker in America was fighting for these better working conditions and is being undercut by this new immigrant who really doesn't understand a concept of what that is. But anyway, that's chapter 25. I hope you guys are all staying safe and practicing social distance. If you need anything, just hit me up on Remind. We've been given the okay to start grading things, so I'm going to start doing that. And also, the AP test is going to be only about 75%. So we pretty much are going to stop at World War II, I think. And I'm going to continue on for DE in high school, but in terms of preparation, if you're taking the AP test, it's only going to go through to World War II. I can't think of anything else except, stay safe. And if you have any questions, hit me up on Remind or an email. But you do have to take this quiz, chapter 25 on immigration, by tomorrow night at midnight.